Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. I'm Lydia Wilson, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. While renovating her house in Damascus from 2005 till 2008, one detail kept nagging at Diana Darke: 3 lines in parallel in a zigzag pattern. None of her Syrian architect friends could tell her where that pattern came from or what it meant. And so she began a mission to trace that design, which led her on a journey through the cathedrals of Europe, right up to Durham Cathedral in the very north of England. Diana turned that mission into an essay for New Lines that we published in 2022 that described how key elements of the architectural period known as the Romanesque may have had their antecedents not in Rome, but in ancient Egypt and the early caliphates of Islam. That insight led her not only all over Europe in the quest for more detail, but also to writing a new book on the subject, Islamisc, the Forgotten Craftsman Who Built Europe's Medieval Monuments, which has just come out. Diana, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Lydia.
So you've written a book about a whole new term for a period of architectural history. Did this whole new theory really begin with the humble zigzag? And can you explain a little how that happened?
Well, it did all begin with a zigzag, yes. I mean, it was a eureka moment, actually, as a result of watching a documentary in which, by some curious chance, you were the presenter. It's called The Secret History of Writing, where the first episode showed you traipsing up a mountain to the site of Cerebral Khadim, where the turquoise mines are. And you explained up there how the very earliest script was developed by migrant workers, and it showed the zigzag as the first use of the zigzag in a phonetic form. And at that moment, I immediately realized that this meant water. I mean, it was just clear as day because of the sound m, which in all Aramaic Semitic languages is the word that the water, may, pronounced in various different ways, but always beginning with the m. That this was the clue. So I then realized that this pattern running around my courtyard was zigzags. It was water flowing around my courtyard, and what's more, it was emerging from a spring. I asked the Syrian architect friend who was living in the house to send me a photo of where it emerged at the side of my Iwan, and he sent me the photo that showed the 3 zigzags emerge from a little circle. So that's representing a spring, and then they flow off round the courtyard and then off into infinity. And he was as excited as I was by this because he'd never known that. And he went off immediately and looked at all the other Ottoman courtyard houses around Damascus and said it's the same in all of them. It was a kind of eureka moment for him too. And it was a real discovery that alerted me to the fact that this might be the clue to something rather more.
Oh, well, I'm so delighted that I could help, that could be the initial moment. And actually, I wrote that episode of History up for New Lines. It was my very first essay in New Lines back in the launch week in October 2020, which, describes that initial invention of the alphabet by a bunch of actually illiterate migrant workers. So that tiny little place, windswept plateau with nothing there, has proven to be inspirational for a lot of different things, including New Lines essays, which is wonderful. So then what you're saying really is that Islamesque actually goes back to way before Islam, because the hieroglyph for water, which, as you say, is a zigzag, and then it gets shortened into RM from Mayim for water. It's many millennia older than the revelation of the Quran. So do you think we can probably always go older when we're looking at architectural society? We can also always push it back to an older influence.
Most definitely. I mean, what I found was that, as I said, the zigzag was the initial clue, but it made me think, my goodness, what if this zigzag, which is, of course, credited as a Norman invention, because when it appears, over here around arches and doorways, And I thought, my goodness, this is not a Norman invention. It does go right back when you have tracked it right the way back. And I tracked it back through Coptic and Fatimid art and architecture as well. So these things are continuous sort of archetypes, if you like, that really do reach right back into the beginnings of civilization, and they're very unchanging. That's the other thing that's really quite striking. But it was through the Islamic world that they got introduced to Europe. That's my reason for calling it Islamesque, which incidentally is a word I've made up for the 21st century in direct challenge to the 19th century Romanesque, which was just invented by a pair of French historians.
So you're calling it Islamesque because that's where the Europeans got it from. But how did it reach us from the Middle East?
Well, this is it. This is what's so interesting when you start to piece together all the clues, and it has been like an incredible piece of detective work, very, very exciting at times, and it shows how basically, at the time that so-called Romanesque bursts out onto the scene, I mean, when you read all the European art history books, they talk about the miracle of Romanesque that appears to come out of nowhere, and suddenly, Europe was able to build these remarkable cathedrals and these incredible techniques without any explanation of where it all came from. But if you look at the timing, and the year sort of round about 1100 is absolutely key in this. So it's round just before and after. So it's the 11th and 12th centuries when all this new architecture, so-called, starts to appear. But that is precisely when the caliphate, the Cordoba Caliphate in Andalusia, in today's Spain and Portugal, and in the Fatimid Caliphate in Sicily, these are the times when they were collapsing, and so new Christian masters were coming in to take over that land. But the people who were absolutely top of their game, I mean, at least 2 centuries ahead of anything in Europe, were the Muslims, the craftsmen working under under Islamic rule. So they weren't exclusively Muslim. Some of them might have been Christians trained in the Islamic tradition, as I call it. But overwhelmingly, the styles that they're bringing in are from North Africa. You can track them back through Umayyad art. You can track them back in Sicily through Fatimid art. And you see them then popping out in the early cathedrals. And so the only explanation for this must be that suddenly these top craftsmen are bringing in not only their understanding of geometry and how to build these incredibly complex new vaulting systems for the roofs, but they're also bringing in their decorative repertoire. And that's what I've unraveled in this book in a way that has astonished even me. I really didn't expect to find so much.
So give us a sense of what you mean. You've mentioned both fundamental structures and the decoration. What is it that makes the big cathedrals of Europe Islamesque?
Well, so one of the decorative influences that I started to notice after a while, because none of this, you have to sort of train your eye to, so the evidence is staring you in the face there, hiding in plain sight. But you have to train your eye to sort of look for certain things and not be distracted by the actual statues of saints and, Christ in majesty and all of these Christian themes. That's not what you're looking at. What you're looking at is how the composition is framed, how the artist has created the frame, how they've set the background. And what you find again and again and again, and I illustrate this in the book, many, many illustrations to show it, the pattern. So things like, for example, the beaded roundel is one of the key things that you can track in. So you have a series of roundels which are intertwined in foliage, and they're often surrounding doorways, especially the main doorways. So if you go and look at, even somewhere like Chartres Cathedral, for instance, which I was visiting just a few weeks ago, you look at all the decoration surrounding the doorways, and it's endlessly flowing foliage with roundels, so medallions, if you like, which are also intertwined endlessly, and they're surrounded with this pearl beaded frame, which is a very Islamic, something that at that time and in the previous centuries you'll find it everywhere in the mosques. You find it not only in the architecture, incidentally, you see it on the textiles, you see it in ivory carvings, you see it in metalwork. It became a sort of real clue, a real sort of trademark for me, that sort of thing. The other thing that's very striking is the lack of symmetry. So, Romanesque, everything to do with Rome, tracing everything back to Rome, classical styles, everything is symmetrical. That was seen as a virtue. In Islamic art, there's a definite move, there's a dislike almost of symmetry, because so much Islamic art and architecture is a kind of recreation of nature, and nature is not symmetrical. Every leaf is different, every little thing is different as a sign of God's creation. And when you look at somewhere like Chartres, just as an example, but it will apply to every Romanesque and early Gothic cathedral that you look at. If you start to look closely at the carving, you'll see that there is no symmetry. So one pillar down the side of the left side of the door will be carved with zigzags, say, and the one on the right-hand side will have lozenges, another very Islamic pattern, by the way. And there's no attempt whatsoever to make them match up on either side. They're almost deliberately celebrating the lack of symmetry.
So, do you think, or do you get any sense in all the research you've done, that the people who were commissioning, building, and using these phenomenal churches across Europe, do you think they had an idea of where these elements were coming from?
Well, that's the very interesting thing. In all the archival sources, from that time across Latin Christendom, of course, it's the name of the bishop, the abbot, who gets all the credit. There's absolutely no mention of the craftsmen. It's always anonymous masters. I just want to explain actually something a little bit about the names, because then by the sort of 13th century, you start to get a few names of craftsmen appearing, like William of Sens, who's credited with the ribbed vaulting in Canterbury Cathedral for bringing that over from France. And so, of course, people see William of Sens, they think, oh, well, obviously he's a Christian. But the other thing I discovered in my research is that you really can't tell anything from a name, because in both Spain and in Sicily, when you look at for instance, the legal documents of that period, I'm talking again about 11th and 12th century, you get references like this piece of land or whatever was bought by Roger, who was once Ahmed. There is such a sort of mix-up of names, and because there was a lot of intermarriage, people forget that. And so then the children sometimes take, a Christian name, sometimes take a Muslim name. It is literally all over the place. You simply cannot tell from somebody's name whether they were Christian or Muslim. You can't make that assumption. So, and of course, craftsmen have always done that, just to fit in.
I actually want to pick up on an anecdote in your book that goes against that slightly, which is that within the Islamic world, so you were talking about an 8th century mosque in Cordoba built by the Umayyads, and you said that there are actual signatures inside that mosque of the Muslim craftsmen.
No, this is really fascinating, because again, what that shows, those masons' marks, which are on display on the back wall of the Cordoba Mesquita, they show that the craftsmen then, and this is 10th century, were both literate and numerate in a way that craftsmen across Europe simply weren't at that time. And it also shows that, of course, once they then started to work for new Christian masters on monasteries and churches and abbeys, of course, there was no point in them continuing with their Arabic signatures. So they changed to use different symbols. And again, one of the things that struck me was that the more complex symbols, Mason's marks, use curves rather than the straight lines of Roman numerals. So you get the curves of the cursive script. The nature and Arabic numerals themselves are, of course, cursive. And that's another fascinating thing, actually. One of the discoveries, again, is this Arabic numerals that were found in the woodwork in Salisbury Cathedral, and indeed on the stone sculpture at Wells, the Wells West Front. And if you look at the way they're carved on the wood, and I've been able to go and see, not in Salisbury Cathedral itself, because they're right up in the timber woodwork, but in similar period of homes that you can go into. These are sort of top prestige, manor houses, bishops' palaces, places like that. So the places where you'd get the absolute elite craftsmen working, and you can just see that they're carved with great confidence. They're not sort of scratched away. And yet, this is 300 years at least before Arabic numerals are in general use in this country. So
It
it
is a
is remarkable.
totally fascinating story. I actually was going to ask you about this, especially the ones in Wells, which
Yeah.
are accessible, aren't they? But there are two systems running in parallel, right? You've got the Roman numerals all over the place in Wells Cathedral, but you've got these Arabic numerals popping up somewhere else. You described how they weren't being used necessarily in the right way that the Muslim craftsman would have used. Can you explain that?
Right. Yes. No, again, this was something else that came to light completely unexpectedly, because people have never really understood why the only position markers um, occur in what's called the resurrection tier, which is, I think, the sixth or seventh row. So it's basically the top row of the sculpture. And it's always mystified people. And then the numbers were also jumbled up. So part of them were Roman and part of them were Arabic, but they weren't in sequence. But by reading very carefully the incredible work by a guy called Jerry Sampson, who worked on the renovation of the front for I think well over a decade, basically, so he knew the stones intimately, and he explains how the workmen themselves. So there was no need for position markers lower down, because the craftsmen themselves responsible for the sculpture were there on site. But then, towards the end, so with the final row of the resurrection tier, there was this dispute. The Bishop of Wells died, and then there was a dispute, a rivalry between two bishops about who would be taking over. And this led to some massive law case in Rome, which then stalled everything for 15 years. The court case went on for 15 years. And so, meanwhile, the top level craftsmen who were doing all that sculpture moved on, basically. They probably hung around for a bit. They finished the actual sculptures and then marked them up in Arabic numerals. That was the only reason they had to mark them up in sequence. And then they moved on. But then 15 years later, when the local craftsmen came to place these statues up in the niches, they couldn't understand these incomprehensible hieroglyphs. And so they put them in all the wrong places where they didn't fit properly. They had to adjust the niches. And Jerry Sampson establishes that if they had actually gone into the correct niches as the Arab craftsmen had intended them, they would have fitted perfectly in the first place.
So it is incontrovertible evidence of Muslim craftsmen being there building wells.
Well, that's what I don't see any other explanation. And people have done their best to come up with other explanations, none of which stand up. I mean, I try to tear those to pieces, if you like. In the book, I do go through them and say people have tried to say X. Well, this can't apply because of Y, to try to sort of show that I've really forensically gone through why the only thing that makes sense is this explanation. And of course, the timing fits completely with this court case. I mean, it all makes sense.
Well, you have made the case very clearly, not just in Wells, but for this whole big movement of details and structures coming in from the Middle East and shaping our architecture. But if it's that clear, as you said, if you get your eye in, why do you think that this contribution of Muslim styles and skills, why do you think it's been ignored for so long?
Well, I keep asking myself that question too, actually, and it is remarkable. It's almost as if Well, obviously it's a common criticism, if you like, of the academic world that people tend to stay within their specialisms. So you get a Byzantine specialist, an Andalusian specialist, an Islamic specialist, a Romanesque specialist, and they don't tend to venture out of their areas very much. But I think I've just been incredibly lucky over the course of my life that I've been able to spend so much time living and working in the Middle East. So I'm very familiar with the buildings there. I lived in Cairo for 4 years. My children were born there. I know it very, very well. And throughout my adult life, I've been exposed to all of that Islamic art and architecture, I suppose, which then deepened obviously through my buying the house and then going back into the academic world to do an MA in Islamic art and architecture. But I think I was lucky that in my childhood, my mother was German and my father was professor of German. And so we spent our childhood every summer, 3 months of every summer, in Europe, basically, visiting my grandparents, but doing, little excursions from there, going around cathedrals. My father would play the organ in all the churches and cathedrals, which was fine in those days. Nothing was locked. You could do what you liked. So I grew up with the cathedrals and all of that side of things sort of in my childhood, and then in my adult life I was exposed to the world beyond Europe, and I could always see the links, and I was rather surprised that other people didn't seem to see them in the way that they were really very clear to me.
Well, it is. It's a sort of visual vocabulary, I suppose, that you have in your head that you can bring together. And in some sense, this book is a sort of prequel to your last book, Stealing from the Saracens, isn't it? I don't know if you mind that kind of language, but what I mean is you made the argument in your previous book that our Gothic style, which is made so famous by cathedrals across Europe, from York Minster that I see every day to Notre Dame in Paris, you made the argument that that was also drawn directly from Islamic architecture. And the famous Christopher Wren, who designed St. Paul's in London, he fully acknowledged and explored this link. But now with this book, with Islamesque, you've gone further back in time, haven't you? So in a way, did it lead directly from that research?
Yes, it did, absolutely. And again, Stealing from the Saracens was not a book I ever intended to write. It was all triggered actually by the fire at Notre Dame itself. When I saw the reaction of the world to the potential destruction of Notre Dame and all this great outcry of our national identity is going up in flames, it made me just a little bit uneasy. And I thought, wait a minute, don't people understand that actually most of the elements of Gothic have actually come from beyond Europe? Because, again, I'd known that for really quite a long time, and I was aware of Christopher Wren's theories, and this is why, actually, Stealing from the Saracens, we chose as the cover of the book the interior of the dome of St. Paul's, because Christopher Wren said, I have used Saracen vaulting, as he called it, in the dome of St. Paul's because it was the best. Simple as that. Of course you're going to use the best if you want to build for eternity, as he did. And he said, what we call the Gothic style should rightly be called the Saracen style. So it was directly because of the fire at Notre Dame that I found myself writing this book, if you like, as a counter-argument to try to explain where the elements of Gothic came from. And so obviously I was already deeply into that subject, and the zigzags were always there in the background, nagging away at me. But yes, if I hadn't written Stealing from the Saracens, I would not have been able to write Islamesque. That's absolutely, absolutely clear.
So there was full acknowledgement in the 17th, 18th century that we drew directly on the Muslim crafts and skills. If Christopher Wren is saying things like that, it was widely acknowledged.
Well, except that, you see, he didn't write it in a published form. He wrote it in letters, in correspondence to, to friends and other people, but very much at the end of his life. So it was a very considered opinion. Somebody like Christopher Wren is not going to just come up with some whimsical idea. He will have given it a great deal of thought. And so that's why I felt you have to take this very seriously. So the structure of Stealing from the Saracens starts with Christopher Wren and his theories, and then goes through them, then geographically to try to assess, is his theory correct? And my conclusion is that yes, at the end of the day, you have to acknowledge that all of these styles that we call Gothic, the twin towers, the rose window, the vaulting techniques, the level of geometry that you need for all of that. And the pointed arch, of course, is the absolute obvious one. There's absolutely no doubt that all of these elements found their way in to Europe through the Islamic world.
So you ask in the introduction to Stealing from the Saracens whether we're ready, and I quote, in the current climate of Islamophobia, to acknowledge that a style so closely identified with our European Christian identity owes its origins to Islamic architecture. So I suppose that's what I'm really getting at with a lot of these questions, is are we able to accept this, and has that changed over time? So how did the responses to that book answer your question? Are we ready to hear this?
Well, to my surprise, the pushback was much less than I expected. I mean, there were critics, but an awful lot of people actually said, my goodness, yes, now that I look at it, now that I understand what I'm looking at, yes, of course I can see it. So people who'd visited Venice, could see straight away that, of course, a lot of the Venetian architecture, known as Venetian Gothic, is, of course, directly borrowed from the Islamic world. And the Venetians openly said that and copied it themselves. And again, this has been shown in books by people like Deborah Howard, who was professor of architectural history at Cambridge, in her wonderful book, Venice and the East. So she tracks it all very carefully there. The same applies for every gateway into Europe, as I call it. So those gateways were Amalfi, the Italian coast, Venice, obviously, and Sicily, and of course, above all, Spain.
Now, it has been said, for instance, by a reviewer of Stealing from the Saracens, that you do occasionally overstate your case. That reviewer, for instance, wasn't completely convinced of your argument linking Big Ben in London and the Great Mosque in Aleppo. Nonetheless, the same reviewer noted that you provide, and I quote, overwhelming evidence of an extensive exchange of ideas and knowledge. Do you think that there will always be some disagreement in the details within a topic that has been so under-researched?
Yes, there will, of course. And that particular reference, by the way, to the Seljuk minaret in the Aleppo mosque and comparing it with Big Ben, I did that. I even wrote in the book, there will be howls of protest, because I knew that people would hate the very idea of Big Ben being likened to a minaret in Aleppo that was 1,000 years old. But if you just look at what the structure. So my point was that it goes up in registers of 4 registers, becoming more and more decorated and elaborate as it goes to the top, and you can. And that's very clear, the same pattern that you get in Big Ben, because Gothic copies that from, and of course Big Ben is neo-Gothic. It had this huge revival in the 19th century Gothic, so it became very, very popular. And so you see it all over London now. I mean, just like now, I see neo-Romanesque all over London. So just yesterday, I was coming out of St Pancras Station, and I thought to myself, "My goodness, look at it! It's just Romanesque, and you just once your eyes are tuned to it, you see the sort of two-tone stonework, the shapes of the arches, the double windows. I mean, the whole thing. It's just once you break it down into the parts, it really is a case of just training your eye to see the details."
It's really fascinating, and your books do that work of breaking it down. We had the medieval historian Ian Mortimer on the podcast, and he mentioned a really fascinating fact that has really stuck with me, that after the Romans left Britain, we simply didn't use some of the technology anymore. For example, roof tiles. They're not seen again in Britain for around 1,000 years. Now, given how effective and durable roof tiles are, there's no need to repair them as much as thatch that was used instead. This is somewhat surprising and a good lesson, I think, in assuming anything about progress, because we genuinely can, as a whole society, forget useful technology. Do you see evidence of the Muslim skills that were brought in being forgotten in Europe?
Yes. So one of the again unexpected things that I came across was one of the Roman things that apparently disappeared was the use of lime mortar to keep stones together. And it's an expensive process to make lime. You have to let it sort of slake or something like that for several months. It has to have a kind of chemical reaction in order to be properly effective and to be durable. But that whole technique was completely lost. There is no evidence for it for centuries after the Romans left. And then it starts to reappear in Irish round towers. And it was never lost in the Islamic world. I mean, never lost. It was very clearly something that continued all the time. And so my theory, and I put it forward in the book in the final chapter, which looks at Britain and Ireland, Islamesque, as I call it, in the British Isles, the possibility that it was Muslim craftsmen who brought back the use of, he reintroduced it, the use of lime mortar, into these structures. And it was only the very rich who could afford to have these, very expensive buildings. So it was kings and bishops. And so, of course, they would have always cast around for the best. If you've got the money and the power, you will always go for the best craftsmen. And at that time, there is no doubt that the top craftsmen, I mean, dominating the construction world, were the Muslims who had been working in Andalusia and in Sicily.
But just to keep on the theme of forgetting for a moment, to what extent do you think that this is deliberate? Is forgetting a natural consequence of history? Does it just happen? Or would you ascribe it, can we ascribe it to something darker? You've written recently about the colonial seizure of Palestinian cultural and archaeological sites by Israel. So do you think that this forgetting is part of a wider effort to rewrite the legacy of Islam in European culture?
Well, I mean, I don't want to think that, but I really don't want to think that. I want to think that it's accidental and that it's just sort of happened, if you like, without intention. But I have to say, sometimes more recently, I'm beginning to wonder about that. And I'll give you an example, actually. I don't know if you've been to the new Silk Roads exhibition
I
in
have,
the British
yes.
Museum.
It's wonderful.
Well, I've been twice now, and on each occasion, I'm afraid I've been really struck by the treatment of the Islamic world, which I don't feel is fair. There's a kind of subtle, possibly unintentional, unconscious bias, whatever it is, just a slight sort of denigrating of the Islamic world. So the plaques explaining the objects. We'll talk about when the Arab conquest came, they imitated and adopted, the previous Byzantine and Sasanian traditions and cultures in art and architecture, full stop, as if that was it. So there's a slight sort of subtext there that all the Arabs ever did was copy and imitate without giving them any credit for the fact that, yes, of course, they built on what came before, just like everybody else did. So yes, they adopted Byzantine and Sasanian art and architecture, but then they developed it further into something unique. They synthesized it into something new that is recognizably different. And one of the things I learned after going around it for the first time, I then looked at who the curators were, and it turns out that one is a Chinese specialist, one is a Byzantine specialist, and the other one is a early Britain and Europe, so Sutton Hoo type specialist, and there is nobody representing the Islamic world. And that, to my mind, really shows going around the exhibition. So I'm a little bit unhappy about it, actually, because it will influence a lot of people, and just very subtly they'll come away with the feeling that, oh, well, all the Arabs ever did was copy what was there before, and get remarkably little credit for actually, well, in my view, the fact that what they actually did was give us in Europe the foundation of all future architectural styles.
I do wonder by looking through one particular lens, in this case, calling it Islamesque is tracing it back to the Middle East and these wonderful kind of skills and syntheses that they offered. But isn't there a possibility that some other elements might be missed? And an example is in that Silk Roads exhibition, because the links weren't just going through the Middle East. It's not as if the trade was all coming through the Middle East. Europe and Africa had their own links to the Asian countries of the Silk Roads. And I wonder, is there a risk of eliding some of the influences from further east, if we call it Islamesque?
Well, I'm only looking at how it entered Europe into Romanesque architecture. And so, yes, of course, the Silk Roads, were incredibly complex and whole networks of places everywhere. So everywhere deserves, in my view, to get its recognition. I just felt that there was a slight, to call it anti-Islamic bias is perhaps going a little bit far, but just as kind of subtle, almost sort of denigration of the Muslim contribution. I feel the balance has gone a bit in that. I'll give you another example, actually. They talk about the learning and knowledge that was transmitted by the monasteries, and they talk about all the manuscripts in the monasteries, without any acknowledgement of the fact that where these manuscripts came from was from the Islamic sources. So in Cordova, for example, the library there had thousands of manuscripts at a time when the monasteries in northern Spain thought themselves very learned if they had 300. So I just feel that sort of thing ought to be made clear, because otherwise people going to the exhibition will just think, oh, yes, the monasteries did all of this. Isn't that wonderful? Weren't those monks clever? But where did they get it all from? And the answer is, at that time, the only people who had all that knowledge were the Muslims who were already in Europe. And, they'd already been in Spain for 800 years, for heaven's sake, and they'd already been in Sicily for 300 years. So you can't just, obviously, I'm not saying that there were no other influences. At that time, because that's very specifically what I'm looking at, is how these elements came in to what we call Romanesque.
Yeah. Well, in both Islamesque and Stealing from the Saracens, your focus is very much on the big Christian monuments. And I wondered, and I don't know if your research went into this, but I couldn't help wondering how far this influence on architecture extended into other types of buildings, the secular rather than the sacred, and the more ordinary dwellings rather than the monumental. Have you seen any evidence for it going further into our society?
Well, yes, definitely. The same thing applied in the palaces, for example, in Spain. And incidentally, that's another thing, how long it carried on for. So Ferdinand and Isabella, for example, in 1492, when they took over Spain in the Reconquista and they moved into the Jaffaria Palace in Zaragoza, they appointed a top Muslim master builder to look after all of their royal palaces in the whole of Aragon. So, clearly, even then, as late as the 15th century, right at the very end of the 15th century, there was no Christian who they felt was up to the job, who had that level of knowledge. And it passed down through his son. The traditions of the master builder were then learnt by the next generation. So there are occasional recorded, documented cases like that where it's very clear that the Christian ruler preferred. Again, it's a case of you go for the best. You can afford the best, you've got the money, so you're always going to go for the best. It doesn't really matter who they are, where they came from. If they can do the best job for you, you're going to go for them.
So you do make the argument very clearly now and in the books that it was the craftsmen who brought so much of this knowledge, this embodied knowledge, into Europe. But I just want to push that a little bit and think of what else might be happening. Now, the 12th century, you've traced this back to the very clear beginnings in the 11th, 12th centuries. And it's, of course, famous in European philosophy for the translation of huge amounts of Arabic texts. It's known as the European translation movement, including lots of Greek works that we didn't have in Europe at that time, but they'd gone into Arabic and then they were translated into Latin. So society and Christianity both are absorbing a lot of new ideas at this time as well. And I think architecture is very strongly influenced by prevailing ideas. And the probably the most clearest case of this is the building of Baghdad. It was founded using astrological guidance. It was built according to Platonic ideals, and many of its features, the smaller decorations, were due to belief in magic and talismans. Now, you do mention, I think, more than once about the use of lions in guarding palaces. I think you track it back to Mesopotamia. But really, it's more than guarding and more than lions, certainly in Baghdad. Features were chosen and carved very carefully to protect buildings and cities. So, do you think it might be that the ideas coming into Europe, these texts about magic, astrology, talismans, do you think they have influenced our buildings as much as the people?
Oh yes, I mean very definitely. All of this knowledge, as you say, coincided, and so that would have given the top clergy some new ideas and things that they wanted to explore. But just because a bishop or somebody has a new idea about something he wants to create in a new building, he's not going to be able to just go round the corner and employ his local builder and say, look, I want you to build me this. I mean, it just simply doesn't work like that in architecture. You have to have the long tradition going back. And as you rightly say, with the case of lions guarding buildings, I mean, that does go right back the gate of, Babylon, the gate of Ishtar, which you can see in the Pergamon Museum. Again, the role of animals in guarding a sacred place is one of these other archetypes that you can go right back with. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that Muslim craftsmen were steeped in this kind of knowledge, and because it all comes from the East, it's part of them. It's just what they've always had in their DNA, if you like, that they bring with them. So when then in Romanesque architecture, you suddenly, in the capitals of cloisters, for example, you get the use of all these fantastical beasts and remarkable hybrid creatures, and the clergy don't understand what it's all about. So the famous quote by Bernard of Clairvaux, when he says, what are these filthy apes doing in our cloisters, distracting us from our prayers? I mean, it kind of proves that the clergy did not understand what all these animals were about. And they come up with some totally preposterous ideas about what they think they're doing then, some of these creatures playing musical instruments and bears playing lutes and dragons playing violas and all this. They come up with crazy ideas when actually my argument is that these are things that the craftsmen themselves have grown up with, and it's kind of a sense of humor coming out in their sculpture, because the bishop will have said, I know, build me a cathedral of this size, in this place. They will have laid down the guidelines like that, and they'll want a statue of themselves put somewhere, and they'll want this or that story from the Bible included. But as to the detail, the bishop doesn't get involved in that level of detail. So the craftsmen have a lot of free reign. That's very clear when you go around and look at all the carvings, because some of them are genuinely hilarious. And again, I trace some of this back to the sort of Egyptian sense of humor, if you like. You can take it all the way back through into the Fatimid, era. Again, which is contemporary, of course, with what we then call what becomes Romanesque and Norman, directly follows on from the Fatimids. And there are so many examples in Fatimid art and architecture of a deliberate poking fun by the craftsman at the ruler. You see it in porcelain dishes, you see it in wood carvings, you see it in metalwork. The deliberate role reversal, again, poking fun at the ruler. There's a whole tradition of it that you find in literature as well.
And where was the most surprising place that you encountered a facet of Islamic influence in Europe?
Ooh, the most surprising. Wow, there are just so many. I can't tell you how overwhelmed I've been by the sheer volume of material. I mean, I had so much. I mean, I could have written several books. Frankly, had a real job to whittle it down to fit into one book. There just is so much. But I think Lincoln Cathedral, the carving, the 12th century carving on the front of of, um, of Lincoln Cathedral in this country was very, very, really hit me in the face. My goodness, the pearl beaded roundels round the portal, the use of zigzags, the use of lozenges. I was just, I mean, I'm not mentioning the obvious things like the pointed arches and things like that, but I'm talking about the detail here, the decorative repertoire, which did not exist before. Actually, one of the other big examples is somewhere like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Again, the putting together the timing there. So Pisa had no local school of architecture of its own. Then it conquered Palermo, and just a few years later, buildings like Pisa Cathedral, and then followed later by the Leaning Tower, appear. And again, you can just see it, these tall blind arches on the ground floor levels with lozenges set in them, the use of these galleried, very delicate, elegant arcades. Again, it's there. It's sort of hitting you in the face, but somehow we think, oh, aren't the Italians amazing that they just created this? But they didn't even have a local school of architecture. How could they just have created that? And then you trace the timing back. Well, okay, they just obviously captured all this knowledge from Palermo, and they almost certainly brought back a few very, very, very top craftsmen to help them with this too.
And so, just to wrap up, you've done the Gothic in Stealing from the Saracens, you've done the Romanesque in Islamesque. What architectural style is getting the dark treatment next?
And believe me, there is more than enough there. And Romanesque is the springboard for everything that comes afterwards in Europe. So there is nothing earlier. I do actually touch on the Carolingian elements, the things that were built under Charlemagne, of which remarkably little is left. And the things that are left are, again, very clearly built by Eastern craftsmen, to put it in people not from Europe. Because again, the styles that they're bringing in didn't exist before. So when something appears like that did not exist before, you have to think, well, hang on a minute, where did it come from? It didn't just pop out like some virgin birth. It was clearly brought in by top people, people at the top of their game from elsewhere.
Well, Diana Darke, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Lydia Wilson. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com. Thank you all for joining us.